Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together for Wednesday, August 19th, and today we're reading Acts chapter 12. Now, Acts 12 begins with bad news. King Herod decided to curry favor with the temple priesthood by arresting some notable Christians. And this Herod was new to the job and doubtless keen to establish credibility. Now, you're probably confused by the name Herod, and you should be, because there are several of them. This is one of the really challenging parts of reading the New Testament. There's a gang of Marys, of Simons, of James, of Herods. Well, get used to it. Now, what about Herod? The first Herod is the one who was around when Jesus was born. He is known as Herod the Great because of his massive building projects, such as the temple in Jerusalem, which he undertook. Now, he had 3 sons who survived. He had other sons, but he murdered them. And upon his death, the surviving sons each took a third of his kingdom. Inconveniently, they are also known as Herod. Herod Archelaus, who was given Judea, where Jerusalem is. Herod Antipas, who was given Galilee and Perea. Galilee is where Nazareth and Capernaum is. And Herod Philip, who was given the northern part of the kingdom. Now, Herod Archelaus was deposed by the Romans for being too brutal, which when it comes to the Romans is quite a job. Now, he was so brutal. Remember that Joseph, upon returning to Israel with Mary and Jesus from their time in Egypt, decided not to settle in Judea because of Archelaus, and he settled in Nazareth instead. After Archelaus was deposed, rather than setting up another kingship, the Romans appointed a series of governors, most notably Pilate. Now, Herod Philip we don't hear a great deal about in the New Testament other than his swapping wives with his brother Herod Antipas. And it's Herod Antipas who has the interactions with Jesus and it's Herod Antipas who puts John the Baptist to death. Now, none of these Herods is the Herod we're talking about today. In Acts chapter 12, the Herod in question is Herod Agrippa the First. Don't worry about Herod Agrippa II yet. Herod Agrippa I in Acts chapter 12, he's the grandson of Herod the Great, and he grew up in Rome rather than in Israel, and happened to be a companion of Claudius, who became Roman emperor in 41 AD, and Claudius appointed his pal Herod Agrippa as the first ruler of the whole country of Israel in that same year. All clear? Good. So this Herod, grandson of the Herod who ordered the death of the baby boys in Jerusalem, is trying to win the favor of the power brokers in Israel. And so he decides to reignite the persecution against the Christians, which had settled down somewhat. And unlike his predecessors, this Herod goes right after the leadership. He has James, brother of John, son of Zebedee, one of the first apostles called by Jesus, put to death. It's amazing to me that Luke says no more about it than that, other than adding the comment that it was an effective move in currying favor with the aforementioned power brokers. Now, James is the first of the original 12 to suffer death for his faith. While Luke doesn't eulogize him, in fact, there isn't much in the New Testament about this James, I have often paid respect to James, visiting his place of burial in Jerusalem at the Armenian Cathedral of St. James, said to be located on the site of James's execution. Now, to be specific, only his head is buried there. The remainder of his bones are believed to be interred at the famous Santiago de Compostela Cathedral in Spain. Many believed that James had undertaken mission work in Spain prior to his martyrdom in Jerusalem. Well, back to Acts. Buoyed by his success and the popularity of putting James to death, Herod then imprisoned Peter with the intention of putting him on trial, and doubtless eventually putting him to the sword after Passover. Perhaps thanks to the prayers of the Jerusalem Christians, a miraculous escape is effected. Peter actually thought he was dreaming the whole thing until he found himself fully awake out on the street. And here's where the story turns from the tragedy of the death of James to high comedy starring Peter and a housemaid named Rhoda. Having come to his senses, writes Luke, Peter, a wanted man, not knowing whether or not a platoon of angry prison guards is hot on his heels, heads for a hiding place. the home of yet another Mary, this one being the mum of John Mark, writer of the gospel which bears his name, the Gospel of Mark. People were gathered there praying for Peter's release. And here Peter shows up and pounds on the locked door. Now Luke tells us that the servant girl, Rhoda, answered the door. Peter's frantically whispering, "Let me in, quick!" But Rhoda's so excited, writes Luke, that in her joy she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. Now, incredibly, an argument ensues. "Are you sure it's Peter?" "Well, are you sure?" Peter, meanwhile, is banging on the door for all he's worth until finally they let him in, to great pandemonium. I love this story. Now, it ends on a poignant note. Telling his tale to the group, Peter ends by saying, "Tell these things to James and to the brothers," before heading for the hills. But which James? Now, Peter obviously knew of the death of James, the brother of John. No, now we're talking about James, brother of Jesus, who we read about in John chapter 7 as not believing in Jesus, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 as having been personally visited by Jesus after the resurrection, and in Acts chapter 1 as being together with the other believers in Jerusalem. James, brother of Jesus, had come around and was now a stalwart and important member of the faith, and we'll hear more about him in chapters to come. But what about Herod, whose evil machinations started this chapter? Well, Luke tells us of his grisly end, being struck down by God and eaten by worms, while, writes Luke, the word of God increased and multiplied. So there, Herod, much the same thing had happened to his grandfather. Now, incidentally, we know from elsewhere that this Herod died in 44 AD, so that gives us a time frame for where we are in history. Now, one final note. You may remember that Saul and Barnabas had been sent from Antioch with monetary relief for the Christians in Judea. Judea includes Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a part of it. Luke tells us that Saul and Barnabas returned to Antioch, bringing with them the very same John Mark, whose mother's house Peter had fled to after his miraculous release. It was a small world back then, this community of believers. Now, John Mark would become a traveling companion of Barnabas and Saul, have a falling out with Saul, continue with Barnabas, who happens to be either his uncle or his cousin, becoming reconciled to Saul, now known as Paul, assisting Paul in his prison ministry, and finally linking up again with Peter, eventually becoming Peter's secretary, composing Peter's accounts of Jesus into a gospel, and becoming like a son to the old fellow. That's not bad for a young man, the first glimpse of whom we had while he fled the scene of Jesus' arrest without a stitch on. The action is building. We'll see you tomorrow for the excitement of chapter 13.